Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've been sheriff of Millbrook County for 16 years now, and in all that time, I thought I'd seen everything a small town of 2,800 people could throw at me. Drunk drivers on back roads, domestic disputes that get out of hand, the occasional meth lab hidden in the woods. Nothing that couldn't be handled with good police work and common sense. That changed on October 14th. When State Highway 47 lost a mile of road, and 3 people vanished along with it. The call came in at 6:23 a.m. from Jerry Hutchins, who runs the morning delivery route for Millbrook Feed and Supply. Jerry's been driving that same route for 12 years, knows every pothole and curve between here and the state line. He called dispatch in a panic, saying the road had just disappeared somewhere between mile marker 23 and 24. "Sheriff, you need to get out here." Jerry's voice was shaking when I arrived on scene 20 minutes later. "I've driven this route every Tuesday for 12 goddamn years, and there ain't never been no detour here." Jerry was standing beside his delivery truck at mile marker 23. Pointing down Highway 47. Normally, the road stretched straight as an arrow for the next 2 miles before curving around Miller's Pond. But now, about a quarter mile ahead, the asphalt just stopped. Not damaged, not under construction, just ended like someone had taken a giant pair of scissors and cut the road clean through. Where mile marker 24 should have been, there was nothing but empty field stretching to the tree line about half a mile away. No road, no guardrails, no evidence that Highway 47 had ever continued past that point. I radioed dispatch to contact the State Department of Transportation, figuring this had to be some kind of maintenance error or mapping mistake. While I waited for them to call back, I walked to the point where the road ended. The asphalt terminated in a perfectly straight line, like it had been sliced with a laser. No broken chunks, no gradual deterioration, just smooth pavement one step and grassland the next. I knelt down and ran my hand along the edge. The asphalt was clean, recently poured based on its condition, but the grass at the edge looked like it had been growing there for years. "Jerry, you sure you took your normal route this morning?" "Sheriff, I could drive this route blindfolded. Left the depot at 5:45, same as always. Made my delivery to Peterson's ranch at marker 19. Continued north like I do every Tuesday. Road was there when I drove up, gone when I looked back." That last part made my skin crawl. Jerry was claiming the road had disappeared while he was driving on it, which was impossible. But Jerry Hutchins wasn't the type to make up stories or see things that weren't there. My radio crackled with a response from the state DOT. "Sheriff Rodriguez, we show Highway 47 as continuous from mile marker 0 to mile marker 47 at the county line. No construction, no closures, no changes to that route in over 15 years. I looked at the GPS unit in my patrol car. According to the satellite navigation, Highway 47 continued straight ahead through the empty field, with mile marker 24 clearly marked at a location where there was nothing but grass and scattered oak trees. "Jerry, get in your truck and follow me. We're going to drive around this area and see if we can find where the road picks up again." We took the farm road that runs parallel to Highway 47, about a mile to the east. After driving north for what should have been 2 miles, we came to a point where Highway 47 reappeared, continuing north from mile marker 25 like nothing had happened. But that's when we discovered the real problem. There were vehicles on that stretch of road. A blue sedan with its hazard lights flashing, and about half a mile further north, a red pickup truck parked sideways across both lanes. I pulled over and approached the sedan on foot. Inside was Margaret Thompson, a 67-year-old retired teacher who lived just outside Millbrook. She was conscious but seemed disoriented, staring ahead through her windshield with a confused expression. "Mrs. Thompson?" I tapped on her window. "Are you all right?" She rolled down the window and looked at me like she'd never seen me before. "Officer, where am I?" "I was driving to my sister's house in Helena, and suddenly Where am I?" "You're on Highway 47, about 5 miles north of Millbrook." "How long have you been sitting here?" "I don't know. I remember driving past the Miller place, and then I was here. But this doesn't look like the road I was on." I helped Mrs. Thompson out of her car and walked her over to my patrol vehicle while Jerry checked on the pickup truck. The driver was Carl Mason, a local contractor who was supposed to be delivering lumber to a job site in the next county. Carl's story was identical to Mrs. Thompson's. He remembered driving north on Highway 47, passing familiar landmarks, and then suddenly finding himself on a stretch of road he didn't recognize, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. "Sheriff, this is going to sound crazy, but I don't think this is the same road I was driving on an hour ago. The hills are wrong, the tree line's different. It's like I'm on Highway 47, but not the Highway 47 I know." I had Jerry drive Mrs. Thompson and Carl back to town while I stayed to investigate the missing section of road. Using my patrol car's odometer, I confirmed that there was exactly 1 mile of Highway 47 that simply didn't exist anymore, despite state records showing it should be there. More concerning was what I found when I examined the area more closely. The field where the missing road should have been showed no signs of recent construction or demolition. The grass was well established, the soil was undisturbed, and there were trees growing in locations where guardrails should have been. But the strangest discovery came when I found tire tracks. Leading from the point where the road ended, there were clear tire impressions in the soft earth, as if vehicles had driven off the pavement and continued straight across the field. The tracks were fresh, probably made within the last few hours, and they led directly toward the spot where Highway 47 reappeared at mile marker 25. I followed the tire tracks on foot, and that's when I made a discovery that still gives me nightmares. About halfway across the field, the tracks simply stopped. Not at an obstacle, not where the vehicle might have gotten stuck or turned around. They just ended, as if the car had driven to that point and then lifted off into the air. There were 3 sets of tracks. One matched the tread pattern on Mrs. Thompson's sedan. Another corresponded to Carl Mason's pickup truck. The third set belonged to a vehicle I hadn't accounted for. I radioed dispatch to run a check on all vehicles that might have traveled Highway 47 that morning. The response came back 20 minutes later with information that made my blood run cold. "Sheriff, we've got a missing person report called in this morning. David Chen, age 34, insurance salesman from Billings. His wife says he left home at 5 a.m. to drive to a client meeting in Millbrook. Should have arrived by 8 a.m. but never showed up for his appointment." David Chen was driving a white Honda Accord, and the third set of tire tracks in the field matched the tread pattern Honda used on that model. I spent the rest of the day coordinating a search with state police and volunteer searchers from town. We covered every inch of the field where the road should have been, looking for any sign of David Chen or his vehicle. We found nothing except those tire tracks that ended in the middle of nowhere. The state sent engineers to survey the area, and their findings defied explanation. According to their measurements, Highway 47 was exactly where it was supposed to be, running straight through the field in question. Their instruments showed continuous pavement, proper elevations, even the painted lane markers that should have been there. But when we looked with our eyes, there was nothing but grass and trees. "Sheriff," the lead engineer said as he packed up his equipment, "our GPS says this road exists. Our ground-penetrating radar shows asphalt and a proper roadbed. But I'm standing here looking at empty field. I've been doing highway surveys for 22 years, and I've never seen anything like this." The missing person investigation for David Chen continued for weeks. We interviewed everyone who might have seen him that morning, checked security cameras at gas stations and businesses along his route, even brought in search dogs to cover the area around the missing road section. But David Chen had vanished as completely as the mile of highway he'd been driving on. The state eventually rerouted traffic around the missing section, putting up signs that directed drivers to take County Road 12 for 2 miles before rejoining Highway 47. The official explanation was ongoing construction, though no construction was actually taking place. 3 months later, I was driving home from a call in the northern part of the county when I decided to check on the missing road section again. It was nearly midnight, and I was alone on Highway 47 when I reached mile marker 23. The road was back. Mile marker 24 stood exactly where it was supposed to be, and the asphalt stretched ahead in an unbroken line toward mile marker 25. I drove the entire section slowly, checking for any signs that it had ever been missing. Everything looked normal, permanent, like it had been there for decades. But when I reached mile marker 25, I noticed something that made me pull over and call for backup. There was a white Honda Accord parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights flashing. Officer Patricia Santos arrived 15 minutes later, and together we approached the vehicle. The driver's door was open, and the car was empty except for a briefcase on the passenger seat containing insurance documents with David Chen's name on them. There was no sign of David himself, but there was something else that defied explanation. According to the car's odometer, it had been driven exactly 1 mile since David had last filled up with gas. But according to his wife and the timeline we'd established, David should have driven at least 60 miles from Billings to reach this location. We found David Chen 3 days later, walking along a rural road about 15 miles southeast of Millbrook. He was disoriented, dehydrated, and had no memory of the past 3 months. The last thing he remembered was driving on Highway 47 toward his appointment in Millbrook. "I was just driving along, listening to the radio," David told me when he was able to give a coherent statement. "Then suddenly, I was walking down a dirt road I'd never seen before, and it was winter. But it was October when I started driving." David was right about the season. When we found him, it was January, and there was snow on the ground. Somehow, he had lost 3 months of time during what should have been a 1-hour drive. The medical examination showed that David was in good health, with no signs of injury or substance abuse. But there were subtle changes that his wife noticed immediately. His hair was longer than it should have been after 3 months. His clothes showed almost no wear despite him being missing for months, and he had no memory of eating or sleeping during the time he was gone. "It's like he was frozen in time," the doctor told me privately. "His physical condition is consistent with someone who disappeared yesterday, not 3 months ago." The case was officially closed as a missing person found, with no explanation for David's disappearance or the missing section of highway. The State Highway Department maintains that Highway 47 has been continuous for over 15 years, with no interruptions or construction. But I know what I saw. I know that a mile of road vanished for 3 months, taking 3 people with it, and only 2 of them came back. And sometimes, late at night when I'm patrolling that section of highway, I see tire tracks leading off the pavement into empty fields, heading toward destinations that don't exist on any map. The road is there now, solid, and permanent as any highway in the state. But I've learned that permanence is an illusion, and that sometimes the routes we travel lead to places we were never meant to go. Highway 47 mile marker 23 to 24 remains the most dangerous mile of road in my jurisdiction, not because of traffic accidents or hazardous conditions, but because sometimes it isn't there at all. And when it disappears, it takes travelers with it to somewhere that exists outside normal time and space. I still patrol that section every night, watching for signs that reality is starting to bend again. Because I know that David Chen wasn't the last person to drive down a road that leads to nowhere. The missing mile is always waiting to claim its next victim. Pine Ridge County covers 1,847 square miles of some of the most beautiful and isolated wilderness in northern Idaho. Dense forests, crystal clear lakes, mountain peaks that scrape the sky, and exactly 847 full-time residents spread across 6 small communities connected by a network of logging roads and fire trails. I've been sheriff here for 11 years, and in all that time, I could count the serious crimes on one hand. Domestic disputes, drunk and disorderly calls, the occasional break-in at a vacation cabin, the kind of law enforcement work where you know everyone by name, and most problems get solved with conversation rather than handcuffs. That all changed on August 23rd, when we started receiving 911 calls from places that don't exist. The first call came in at 2:47 a.m. Dispatch operator Linda Martinez had been working nights for 8 years and knew the voice of every person in the county who might call for emergency services. But this voice was unfamiliar. A young woman, crying, saying she was lost in the woods and needed help. Please, someone help me. I've been walking for hours and I can't find my way back to the road. I'm somewhere near Pine Ridge Lake, but everything looks different. The trees are wrong. The rocks are wrong. This isn't the same forest I walked into. Linda tried to get more specific location information, but the caller became increasingly agitated and confused. She claimed she'd started hiking from the Bear Creek trailhead, which was impossible because Bear Creek was on the other side of the county from Pine Ridge Lake. Ma'am, I need you to stay calm and try to describe what you can see around you. Are there any landmarks, any signs, anything that might help us locate you? There's a cabin, a log cabin with smoke coming from the chimney, but it's not supposed to be here. I've hiked this area dozens of times and there's never been a cabin here before. The call cut off before Linda could get any additional information. She immediately contacted me and the volunteer search and rescue team, and we began preparing for a wilderness search operation. But before we could deploy, we received a second call. This one came from the same general area, but from a different caller. An elderly man who claimed to be trapped in his truck after rolling it into a ravine. This is Bill Morrison. My truck went off the road about 3 miles past the Pine Ridge Lake turnoff. I'm hurt pretty bad and I can't get out. Please send help. I knew Bill Morrison. He'd lived in Pine Ridge County for 40 years, owned a cabin near Lost Creek, and was one of the most experienced outdoorsmen in the area. But according to our records, Bill Morrison had died in a hunting accident 6 years earlier. Linda checked the caller ID and confirmed that the call was coming from Bill's old cell phone number, the one that had been disconnected after his death. She tried calling back, but the number was no longer in service. By dawn, we'd received 11 more calls from people claiming to be lost or injured in various locations throughout the county. The callers gave names and details that checked out in our records, but every single one of them was someone who had died in Pine Ridge County over the past 15 years. Margaret Stevens, who died in a car accident in 2018, called to report that her vehicle had broken down on Highway 12. Tommy Brennan, who'd drowned in Pine Ridge Lake in 2019, called to say he was stranded on an island in the middle of the lake and needed rescue. Dr. James Patterson, who'd had a heart attack while fishing in 2016, called to request medical assistance for chest pains. All of the calls were coming from locations that our GPS systems couldn't verify, coordinates that didn't correspond to any known roads or landmarks in the county. I assembled every available deputy and volunteer for what was shaping up to be the largest search and rescue operation in Pine Ridge County history. But before we could begin deploying teams, we received a call that changed the entire nature of the investigation. At 8:15 a.m., Linda answered a 911 call from someone who identified herself as Linda Martinez. 911, what's your emergency? This is Linda Martinez, 911 dispatcher for Pine Ridge County. I'm calling to report that I'm lost somewhere in the woods near Bear Creek. I've been walking all night and I can't find my way back to town. Linda was sitting at her dispatch console when she took the call, talking to someone who claimed to be herself, but was lost in the wilderness. She tried to explain to the caller that she was Linda Martinez, that she was safe at the sheriff's office, but the other Linda became increasingly frantic. That's impossible. I'm Linda Martinez. I work the night shift at dispatch. I was driving home after work when my car broke down, and I got lost trying to walk back to the highway. The call lasted for 12 minutes, with Linda talking to someone who had her voice, her memories, and her personal information, but who claimed to be trapped in a forest that didn't match any location in Pine Ridge County. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with a standard search and rescue situation. We were dealing with something that challenged the basic laws of reality itself. I contacted the state police and requested assistance from their technical investigation unit. While I waited for them to arrive, I decided to investigate some of the locations where the mysterious calls claimed to be originating. The first stop was the coordinates given by the young woman who'd called about being lost near Pine Ridge Lake. According to her description, she should have been near a log cabin with smoke coming from the chimney, located about 2 miles north of the lake's main boat launch. I knew that area well. I'd fished and hunted there for 20 years, and there had never been any structures in that location. But when I arrived at the coordinates, I found something that shouldn't have existed. There was a log cabin, exactly as the caller had described it. Smoke was rising from the chimney, and through the windows I could see warm light suggesting that someone was home. But the cabin looked old, weathered, like it had been there for decades. I approached the front door and knocked, identifying myself as sheriff. No one answered, but I could hear movement inside, the sounds of someone trying to stay quiet and avoid detection. Sheriff's Department, I need to speak with whoever's inside. The door opened to reveal a young woman in her 20s with long brown hair and hiking clothes. She looked exactly like the mental image I'd formed of the caller who'd reported being lost in the woods. "Thank God," she said, relief flooding her voice. "I've been trapped here all night. I tried to leave, but every time I walk away from the cabin, I end up right back at the front door." "What's your name, miss?" "Amy Chen. I was hiking the Pine Ridge Lake Trail yesterday afternoon when I got turned around. I found this cabin and thought I could ask for directions, but no one was home. When it started getting dark, I decided to stay here overnight. I asked Amy to show me identification, and she produced a driver's license with her photograph and an address in Seattle. According to the license, she was 23 years old and had no criminal history when I ran her information through our database. But when I contacted the Seattle Police Department to verify her identity, they told me something that made my blood run cold. "Sheriff Harrison, we have a missing person report on Amy Chen filed yesterday by her roommate. But Amy Chen has been missing for 3 years. She disappeared during a hiking trip in the Olympic Mountains and was presumed dead after an extensive search found no trace of her." I looked at Amy, who was standing on the cabin's front porch, looking confused and frightened. "Amy, what year do you think it is?" "It's 2021, August 23rd. I started hiking yesterday morning, and I've been lost since about 4 p.m. "Amy, it's 2024. You've been missing for 3 years. She stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "That's impossible. Look at my phone." She showed me her cell phone, which displayed the date as August 23rd, 2021. But when I checked my own phone, it clearly showed August 23rd, 2024. I radioed for backup and requested that Deputy Wilson bring the crime scene investigation kit. While I waited for him to arrive, I searched the cabin looking for clues about who owned it and how long it had been there. The cabin was fully furnished with period pieces that looked like they belonged in the 1970s or 1980s. There was no electricity, but the place was heated by a wood-burning stove and lit by kerosene lamps. The refrigerator was an old propane model, stocked with food that appeared fresh despite the cabin's apparent isolation. In the cabin's guest register, I found entries dating back to 1987. Hikers, hunters, and campers who had used the cabin as emergency shelter during bad weather, or when they'd gotten lost in the wilderness. But according to county records, there had never been any privately owned structures in that location. Deputy Wilson arrived with the investigation equipment, and we began documenting the impossible cabin and its equally impossible occupant. That's when we made a discovery that transformed this case from mysterious to terrifying. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin's bedroom, we found a metal lockbox containing documents that shouldn't have existed. Property deeds dating back to 1924, signed by people who had died decades before the dates on the paperwork. Construction permits for the cabin issued by a version of Pine Ridge County government that had never existed. Most disturbing of all was a handwritten journal kept by someone who identified himself as the caretaker. The entries spanned from 1924 to the present day, written in the same handwriting, despite covering a period of nearly a century. March 15th, 1924. The boundary is weakening again. More travelers are finding their way to places they were never meant to go. I've been tasked with maintaining the cabin, providing shelter for those who become lost between worlds. September 3rd, 1956. A family from the future appeared today. They claim it's 1987, but I know it's still 1956. Time moves differently for those who cross the boundary. I've given them supplies and told them how to find the path back to their own timeline. December 21st, 1987. The disappearances are increasing. People from different times are all arriving in the same location, drawn by something that exists outside normal temporal flow. I'm beginning to understand that Pine Ridge County occupies a unique position, a place where multiple time streams intersect. August 23rd, 2021. A young woman named Amy Chen has arrived from 3 years in the future. She doesn't understand what's happened to her, believes she's only been lost for 1 day. I must help her find her way back to 2024, where she belongs. I read that last entry 3 times, trying to process what it meant. According to the journal, today's date was August 23rd, 2021, but I knew it was 2024. Either the journal writer was delusional, or time itself was functioning differently in this location. "Sheriff," Amy called from the cabin's front porch. "I think I can see the trail now. There's a path leading back toward the lake that wasn't there before." I looked in the direction she was pointing and saw what appeared to be a well-worn hiking trail leading northeast through the forest. But I'd been in these woods hundreds of times, and there had never been a trail in that location. "Amy, I need you to stay here while we investigate this cabin. Don't try to leave until we understand what's happening." But even as I said it, I could see the trail becoming more distinct, more real. as if it was materializing in response to Amy's desire to return home. Deputy Wilson was examining the cabin's construction with growing confusion. "Sheriff, this structure shows signs of weathering consistent with being here for decades, but the building techniques and materials are from different time periods. The foundation stones look like they were quarried in the 1920s, but the roof shingles are modern composite materials that weren't invented until the 1990s. Before I could respond to Wilson's observation, my radio crackled with another call from dispatch. "Sheriff Harrison, we've got a situation developing at the highway patrol station. State trooper says he's got multiple vehicles stopped for traffic violations, but the drivers are all claiming to be from different years. One says it's 1987, another claims it's 2019, and a third insists it's 2031. I realized that whatever was happening at the cabin was spreading throughout Pine Ridge County. The boundary between different time periods was breaking down, allowing people from past and future to appear in our present moment. Wilson, secure this location and don't let Amy leave until I get back. I need to check on these traffic stops." I drove to the highway patrol station, where Trooper Martinez had 3 vehicles pulled over on the shoulder of Highway 12. The first was a 1987 Chevrolet pickup truck in pristine condition, driven by a man who appeared to be in his 40s, but was dressed in clothing that looked like it belonged in a 1980s catalog. "Officer, I don't understand why I'm being stopped," the driver said, showing me a license that was supposedly issued in 1987 but looked brand new. "I'm just driving to Coeur d'Alene for my job interview at the lumber mill." The second vehicle was a 2019 Toyota sedan driven by a woman who claimed she was late for her daughter's graduation ceremony. But when I asked her about current events, her knowledge stopped abruptly in 2019, as if the last 5 years had never happened for her. The third vehicle was the most unsettling. It appeared to be a car model I didn't recognize, with technology that seemed advanced beyond anything currently available. The driver was a young man who insisted it was 2031, and that he was driving to a job at a temporal research facility that didn't exist anywhere in Idaho. "Sheriff," Trooper Martinez said quietly, "I've run all 3 licenses through the system. The 1987 license belongs to a man who died in an industrial accident in 1992. The 2019 license belongs to a woman who's currently 67 years old and living in a nursing home in Boise. And the 2031 license, well, our system doesn't recognize the format." All 3 drivers seemed genuinely confused about being stopped, and each was convinced that their version of the current date was correct. They looked at each other with the same confusion they directed at us, as if they couldn't understand why anyone would think it was a different year. That's when I realized that Pine Ridge County was experiencing some kind of temporal anomaly that was pulling people from different time periods into our present moment. But unlike science fiction stories, these weren't time travelers who had deliberately crossed temporal boundaries. They were ordinary people who had gotten lost and found themselves in the wrong time. I contacted the FBI's X-Files division, figuring that if anyone would take this case seriously, it would be federal agents who specialized in unexplained phenomena. While I waited for them to arrive, I returned to the cabin to check on Amy Chen and Deputy Wilson. What I found when I got back to the cabin site made me question my own sanity. The cabin was gone, not destroyed, not moved, just gone. Where it had been standing an hour earlier, there was nothing but forest floor covered with decades of accumulated leaves and fallen branches. "Wilson, where's the cabin?" "What cabin, Sheriff?" "There's never been any structure here. I've been standing in this exact spot for an hour, and it's been empty forest the whole time." I stared at him, trying to understand what he was saying. The log cabin with Amy Chen inside. You were supposed to keep her here until I got back. Wilson looked at me with genuine concern. Sheriff, are you feeling all right? You dropped me off here and told me to secure this location, but there's nothing here to secure. No cabin, no person named Amy Chen, just trees. I pulled out my phone and showed Wilson the photographs I'd taken of the cabin and Amy. But when I looked at the images, they showed nothing but empty forest. According to my phone's camera, there had never been any cabin in this location. But I could still see the impressions in the forest floor where the cabin's foundation stones had been. I could smell the lingering scent of wood smoke from the chimney. And in my pocket, I still had Amy Chen's business card, which she'd given me before I left to investigate the traffic stops. Wilson, look at this business card. Amy Chen, graphic designer, Seattle address and phone number. Wilson examined the card carefully. Sheriff, this card is blank. There's nothing printed on it. I looked at the card in his hands, and he was right. It was completely blank, just white cardstock with no text or graphics. But I could still see Amy's information printed clearly on what appeared to be the same card. The FBI agents arrived 6 hours later, and their investigation lasted for 3 days. They brought equipment I'd never seen before, conducted interviews with everyone who had experienced temporal anomalies, and collected samples of soil and vegetation from locations where impossible things had been reported. Their final report was classified, but Agent Sarah Coleman gave me an unofficial briefing before they left Pine Ridge County. Sheriff Harrison, what you've experienced here is consistent with a phenomenon we've encountered in fewer than a dozen locations worldwide. Places where the normal flow of time becomes unstable, allowing past and future to bleed through into the present moment. What causes it? We don't know for certain, but there seems to be a correlation with locations that have experienced significant trauma or emotional energy over long periods of time. Pine Ridge County has a history of disappearances, accidents, and tragedies going back to the 1800s. It's possible that the accumulated psychic energy has created weak points in the temporal fabric. Is it dangerous? Not directly. The people who experience temporal displacement usually return to their correct time period within 24 to 48 hours. But there can be psychological effects, memory confusion, difficulty distinguishing between past and present, sometimes permanent disorientation. Agent Coleman was right about the psychological effects. 3 months after the temporal anomaly event, I started having difficulty remembering which year it was. Sometimes I'd find myself driving to locations that had been demolished decades ago, or calling phone numbers for people who had died years before I became sheriff. I retired from law enforcement 6 months later, unable to trust my own perception of time and reality. But I still live in Pine Ridge County, and I still monitor the police scanner every night, listening for reports that might indicate another temporal event. Because I know it's going to happen again. The boundary between past, present, and future is thin here, and sometimes it breaks down completely. When it does, people from different times find themselves sharing the same location, the same moment, trying to understand why their reality doesn't match everyone else's. Amy Chen made it back to her own time, according to a report I received from the Seattle Police Department 3 weeks after she disappeared from the cabin. She was found on a hiking trail in the Olympic Mountains, confused and disoriented, with no memory of the 3 years she'd been missing. But sometimes, late at night when I'm walking through the forests around Pine Ridge Lake, I see the cabin again. Smoke rising from the chimney, warm light glowing in the windows, Amy Chen sitting on the front porch waiting for someone to help her find her way home. Time is more fragile than most people realize. It's not a river flowing in one direction, but a web with weak points where past and future can touch. Pine Ridge County sits on one of those weak points. and sometimes the web tears just enough to let people slip through. The next time it happens, I'll be ready, because someone needs to help the lost travelers find their way back to when they belong. The forest remembers everyone who's ever been lost in its depths, and sometimes it brings them back, even if they come from the wrong year. Dry Creek County is the kind of place people drive through without stopping. 1,200 square miles of desert, scrub brush, and rocky mesas, with a population that hovers around 600 people, spread across 3 tiny communities connected by aging state highways. The biggest excitement we usually see is tourists getting lost on their way to the Grand Canyon, or the occasional smuggling operation trying to move drugs north from the Mexican border. I've been sheriff here for 14 years, and in all that time, the strangest case I'd handled involved a man who claimed his pickup truck had been stolen by aliens. Turned out he'd just forgotten where he parked it after a 3-day drinking binge in Tucson. That all changed on September 8th, when old radio tower KDRC started broadcasting again, after being silent for 27 years, and the voices coming through the transmissions were from people who had died decades ago. KDRC had been Dry Creek County's only radio station from 1952 until 1997, when the owner died and no one could afford to maintain the broadcasting license. The tower stood about 12 miles east of town on a mesa that provided good coverage across the county and into parts of New Mexico. After the station went dark, the equipment was supposed to have been removed, but like a lot of things in Dry Creek County, the cleanup never quite happened. The first report came from Betty Hutchins, who ran the diner on Main Street and usually opened at 5 a.m. to catch the early shift workers heading to the copper mine. Betty called my office at 5:23 a.m. in a state of considerable agitation. "Sheriff Thompson, you need to get down here right away. The radio in my kitchen is picking up KDRC, and they're playing music from before I was born. But that station's been off the air since my husband died." I drove to Betty's diner, expecting to find that she'd accidentally tuned in to a distant station, or maybe picked up some kind of atmospheric skip that was bringing in broadcasts from hundreds of miles away. But when I walked into the kitchen, I heard something that made my skin crawl. The radio was playing big band music from the 1940s, which wasn't unusual by itself. Lots of stations had nostalgia programming, but between the songs there were local announcements that specifically mentioned businesses and people from Dry Creek County's past. You're listening to KDRC 1340 on your radio dial, broadcasting from beautiful Dry Creek County, Arizona. Coming up after this musical selection, we'll have the weather forecast from Harold Peterson and local news with Margaret Chen. But first, a reminder that Henderson's Hardware is having their annual tool sale this weekend with special discounts for our mining families. Henderson's Hardware had closed in 1987 when the original copper mine shut down. Harold Peterson had been the county's weather observer until he died in a car accident in 1963. And Margaret Chen had worked as a news reporter for KDRC until the station went dark in 1997. But she died in a nursing home in Phoenix 3 years ago. "Betty, how long has this been going on?" "Started about an hour ago. Just came on the air like normal, playing music and giving local announcements. But Sheriff, they're talking about people in places that don't exist anymore. I tried tuning the radio to other stations, but 1340 was the only frequency that would come through clearly. Every other station was either static or so faint it was barely audible. This is KDRC with your local weather forecast. Harold Peterson here with your Tuesday morning report. We've got clear skies and hot temperatures expected today, with a high of 108 degrees. Winds from the southwest at 10 to 15 miles per hour. Remember, folks, if you're working outdoors today, drink plenty of water and take frequent breaks in the shade. The weather forecast was accurate for that day, despite coming from a man who had been dead for 60 years. I radioed Deputy Maria Santos and asked her to drive out to the KDRC tower site to see if there was any equipment operating that might explain the broadcasts. While she was checking the tower, I decided to visit some of the other businesses in town to see if anyone else was receiving the mysterious transmissions. At Morales Auto Repair, the radio in the garage was tuned to KDRC and playing what sounded like live local programming from the 1950s. The announcer was discussing a high school basketball game between Dry Creek and Copper Valley, two schools that had been consolidated and closed 30 years ago. Final score from last night's game at the old gymnasium: Dry Creek 67, Copper Valley 52. Congratulations to our Eagles on another fine victory. Coach Martinez says the team is looking strong heading into the regional tournament next month. Coach Martinez had died in 1989, and the old gymnasium had been demolished in 2003 when the school district built a new consolidated facility in the county seat. More disturbing than the impossible broadcasts was the fact that some of the older residents were responding to them as if they were normal. Emma Rodriguez, who was 87 and had lived in Dry Creek County her entire life, was listening to KDRC in her kitchen and nodding along with the announcements. "Sheriff, isn't it wonderful that Harold's back on the radio? I've missed his weather reports. He was always so accurate, much better than those meteorologists on the television. Emma, Harold Peterson died in 1963. This can't really be him on the radio." She looked at me with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Of course it's Harold. I'd recognize his voice anywhere. He's been doing the weather on KDRC for as long as I can remember." I tried showing Emma photographs of Harold Peterson from the County Historical Society, images that clearly showed he'd been a young man in the 1960s. But when she looked at the pictures, she saw them differently than I did. "That's Harold, all right. Took that picture just last week when he was doing a remote broadcast from the county fair. He looks good for his age, don't you think?" Deputy Santos radioed in from the tower site with a report that defied rational explanation. "Sheriff, the KDRC tower is active. All the broadcasting equipment is operational, and there are lights on in the studio building. But according to the county records, this place was stripped bare and abandoned in 1998. Is there anyone at the site? I can see people moving around in the studio through the windows, but when I knocked on the door, no one answered. The door's locked, and all the windows are too high for me to see inside clearly. Secure the site and wait for me to arrive. Don't try to enter the building alone." I drove out to the KDRC tower site, following a dirt road that hadn't been maintained in decades. The tower stood on a mesa about 300 feet above the desert floor, accessible only by a winding track that was barely wide enough for one vehicle. When I reached the top of the mesa, I found a fully operational radio station that looked exactly like it would have in the 1950s. The broadcast tower was in perfect condition, with red aircraft warning lights blinking at regular intervals. The studio building showed fresh paint and maintenance, with cars parked outside that looked like they belonged in a classic car show. Deputy Santos was standing near her patrol car, staring at the building with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Sheriff, 30 minutes ago this place was a ruin. Broken windows, roof caved in, equipment stripped out. Now it looks like it's been operating continuously for decades." I approached the studio building and peered through the windows. Inside, I could see people working at radio equipment that appeared to be a mix of vintage and modern technology. A man who looked like he was in his 40s was seated at a microphone, speaking into it with the professional cadence of an experienced radio announcer. But when I looked more closely, I realized I recognized him from old photographs in the County Historical Society. It was Harold Peterson, looking exactly as he had in pictures from the early 1960s, apparently no older despite the fact that he should have been dead for 60 years. I knocked on the studio door and identified myself as Sheriff. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 30s wearing clothing that looked like it belonged in the 1950s. "Good morning, Sheriff. I'm Margaret Chen, news director for KDRC. Is there something we can help you with?" I stared at her, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be true. Margaret Chen had been elderly when the station went dark in 1997, and she died in 2021. The woman standing in front of me looked like Margaret might have looked in the 1950s, when she'd first started working in radio. "Miss Chen, what year do you think it is?" She looked at me with mild confusion. "It's 1959, of course. September 8th, to be specific. We're just finishing up our morning show before transitioning to our midday music programming." "Miss Chen, it's 2024. KDRC went off the air in 1997, and you died 3 years ago." Her expression didn't change, as if she hadn't heard what I'd said or couldn't process it. "I'm sorry, Sheriff, but I think you might be confused. KDRC has been broadcasting continuously since 1952. We've never been off the air." I asked if I could come inside and look around, and Margaret welcomed me into the studio. What I found inside defied every assumption I'd made about reality and the nature of time itself. The radio station was fully operational, with equipment that spanned from the 1950s to the present day somehow working together in perfect harmony. Vacuum tube amplifiers from the early days of radio were connected to digital mixing boards that wouldn't be invented for decades. But everything functioned seamlessly, as if the different technologies had been designed to work together. Harold Peterson was indeed alive and broadcasting, looking exactly as he had in photographs from 60 years ago. He greeted me warmly and seemed genuinely pleased to meet the current sheriff, though he showed no awareness that he should have been dead for decades. "Sheriff Thompson, good to finally meet you. I've been doing weather reports for Dry Creek County since 1952, and I've worked with a lot of sheriffs over the years. How are you enjoying the job? Mr. Peterson, you died in a car accident in 1963. I've seen the police reports and the death certificate." Harold looked confused. "I think you might have me confused with someone else, Sheriff. I've been doing the morning weather report here at KDRC for 7 years now. Never had any car accidents. Never been seriously hurt." I showed Harold a newspaper clipping from 1963 that reported his death, but when he looked at the article, he saw something different than what I was reading. To him, the newspaper appeared to be reporting on a completely different story. That's when I realized that everyone in the radio station was experiencing time differently than the outside world. To them, it was still 1959, and they had no awareness that decades had passed or that they should have aged or died. Margaret gave me a tour of the facility, showing me production equipment, record libraries, and office spaces that contained a mixture of items from different time periods. There were 78 RPM records from the 1940s sharing shelf space with compact discs from the 1990s, all of them organized as if they'd been collected over a continuous period of operation. In the station's news archives, I found files on every major event in Dry Creek County's history, from the 1950s to the present day. But the more recent files were written from the perspective of people who had supposedly died decades earlier, as if Margaret Chen and her colleagues had continued covering local news long after their natural lifespans should have ended. "How do you get information about current events?" I asked Margaret as she showed me the newsroom. "Oh, we have correspondents throughout the county who call in reports," she replied matter-of-factly. "People really appreciate having a local news source that understands the community." "Who are your correspondents?" Margaret consulted a list on her desk. "Let's see. We have Emma Rodriguez in town, Joe Martinez at the old copper mine, Sarah Patterson out at the ranch district. All longtime residents who keep us informed about what's happening in their areas. Every name on the list belonged to someone who had died within the past 10 years. But according to Margaret, they were all active contributors to KDRC's news coverage. I asked to use the station's phone to call my office, and Margaret directed me to a telephone that appeared to be from the 1950s, but somehow had a modern dial tone. When I called dispatch, Linda answered with her usual professional greeting. Dry Creek County Sheriff's Office, this is Linda. Linda, this is Sheriff Thompson. I'm at the KDRC radio station and I need you to run some background checks on the people working here. Sheriff, I'm not sure what you mean. KDRC has been off the air since 1997. The station building is abandoned, and the tower equipment was removed years ago. I looked around the fully operational radio station, watching Harold Peterson deliver his afternoon weather forecast, while Margaret Chen prepared the next news segment. Linda, I'm standing inside a functioning radio station. There are people here, broadcasting live programming. Sheriff, are you feeling all right? Maybe you should come back to the office so we can talk. I realized that from the perspective of the outside world, KDRC really was abandoned and silent. The operating radio station only existed for people who were somehow connected to its impossible timeline. But when I tried to leave the mesa, I discovered that my patrol car wouldn't start. Deputy Santos's vehicle was also dead, despite both cars having been running normally when we'd arrived. Looks like you might be staying for a while, Harold said cheerfully when I told him about the car trouble. That happens sometimes when people visit us from other times. The equipment doesn't always work properly when you're switching between different temporal periods. Different temporal periods. Oh yes, Sheriff. KDRC exists in a special place where multiple time periods intersect. We're able to serve listeners from 1952 to the present day, all broadcasting simultaneously. It's quite an honor to be part of something so unique. I spent the next 6 hours at the radio station, listening to programming that somehow included music, news, and announcements from every decade since the 1950s, all presented as if they were contemporary. The station's audience apparently included listeners from different time periods, all tuning into the same broadcast but hearing content that was relevant to their particular era. At sunset, Margaret announced that it was time for the evening shift change, and I watched as the current staff prepared to leave. But instead of driving away in the vintage cars parked outside, they simply faded away like morning mist, leaving behind empty spaces where they'd been standing. New staff members appeared to take their places, people I recognized from county records as residents who had died in different decades, all of them looking exactly as they had in life but now working together at a radio station that existed outside normal time. My patrol car started normally when I tried it again after the shift change, and Deputy Santos and I were able to drive away from the mesa without any mechanical problems. But when I looked back at the KDRC site from the bottom of the access road, the building appeared abandoned and dark, with no signs of activity. The broadcasts continued for 3 more days, providing programming to listeners throughout Dry Creek County who had radios capable of receiving transmissions from 1340 a.m. But only the oldest residents seemed to hear the programming clearly. Younger people reported static or faint signals that faded in and out. On September 11th, KDRC went silent again, returning to the inactive status it had maintained since 1997. The tower site returned to its abandoned condition, and attempts to tune in 1340 a.m. resulted in nothing but empty static. I filed an official report describing the incident as unexplained technical malfunction causing temporary reactivation of abandoned broadcast equipment. But I kept the detailed notes I'd taken during my time at the station, documenting conversations with people who had been dead for decades, but were somehow still broadcasting to an audience that spanned multiple time periods. 6 months later, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a photograph of the KDRC staff from September 8th, showing Harold Peterson, Margaret Chen, and several other people I'd met during my visit to the station. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Thank you for visiting KDRC during our special anniversary broadcast. We hope you enjoyed hearing from old friends again." The photograph showed me standing in the background of the group shot, despite the fact that I'd never posed for any pictures while I was at the station. KDRC broadcasts sporadically now, maybe once or twice a year, always during significant dates in Dry Creek County's history. Anniversaries of major events, holidays that were particularly meaningful to the community, sometimes just quiet evenings when the atmosphere is right for voices from the past to reach listeners in the present. I monitor 1340 a.m. every night before I go to bed, listening for the familiar voices of Harold Peterson's weather reports and Margaret Chen's local news updates. Because in a county where the living population is steadily declining and young people move away to find opportunities elsewhere, it's comforting to know that the voices of the past are still available to keep us company. Radio waves don't die when the people who broadcast them pass away. In the right conditions, with the right equipment, those voices can still reach us across decades, bringing news and music and weather reports from times when Dry Creek County was busier and more prosperous. KDRC reminds us that the past isn't really gone. It's still broadcasting, still trying to serve its community, still connecting people across the years with the simple human comfort of a familiar voice in the darkness. All you have to do is tune in to the right frequency and listen for the voices that refuse to be silenced by something as simple as death. The airwaves remember everyone who ever spoke into a microphone, and sometimes, when conditions are perfect, they broadcast those memories back to anyone willing to listen. Saguaro County runs along 63 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border, covering some of the most remote and dangerous terrain in the American Southwest. Endless desert, jagged mountain ranges, and summer temperatures that can kill an unprepared traveler in less than 6 hours. It's the kind of place where people disappear regularly and their bodies are never found. I've been sheriff here for 9 years, and most of my job involves search and rescue operations for border crossers who've gotten lost in the desert, drug interdiction working with federal agencies, and the occasional investigation into smuggling operations that use our isolated location to move contraband north toward Phoenix and Tucson. What I'd never encountered before last November was a border crossing that led to a place that doesn't exist on any map of Mexico or anywhere else on Earth. The incident began on November 23rd when Border Patrol agent Carlos Mendoza called my office requesting assistance with what he described as the strangest situation I've encountered in 15 years of border security work. Carlos had apprehended a family of 4, 2 adults and 2 children, who had crossed the border illegally about 12 miles west of the official port of entry. Nothing unusual about that. We see dozens of similar cases every month. But when Carlos tried to determine where the family had crossed from, their story challenged everything he thought he knew about the geography of the border region. Sheriff Rodriguez, these people claim they walked here from a city called Esperanza Nueva that's supposed to be about 20 miles south of the border. But I've been working this sector for 15 years, and there's no city by that name anywhere in Sonora. Hell, there's no city of any name within 50 miles of where they crossed. I met Carlos and the apprehended family at the Border Patrol processing station, a small facility about 5 miles north of the international boundary. The family consisted of Miguel Santos, age 34, his wife Carmen, age 31, and their children Maria, 8, and Jose, 6. They were in good health despite claiming to have walked for 2 days through desert terrain. Miguel spoke fluent English and was cooperative when I interviewed him about their journey. His story was detailed, consistent, and completely impossible. We left Esperanza Nueva on Monday morning, Miguel explained, showing me a hand-drawn map of their route. The city has been suffering from drought and economic problems for years, so we decided to seek opportunity in the United States. We walked north through the desert, following the old mining roads until we reached the border fence. The map Miguel had drawn showed a detailed layout of roads, landmarks, and geographic features that should have been visible from any satellite imagery of the region. But when Carlos and I compared Miguel's map to official Border Patrol charts and GPS data, none of the features he'd marked corresponded to anything that actually existed. Miguel, can you show me Esperanza Nueva on this satellite map? I asked, spreading out a detailed chart of the Sonoran Desert region. Miguel studied the map carefully, then pointed to an area about 18 miles southeast of our location. It should be right here, next to the Sierra de los Santos Mountains, but I don't understand. This map shows only empty desert where our city should be. The area Miguel had indicated was indeed empty desert, confirmed by multiple satellite images dating back to the 1970s. There had never been any settlement, road, or permanent structure in that location. But the children, Maria and Jose, provided even more disturbing evidence that their family's story was true, at least from their perspective. They had drawings in their backpacks that showed scenes from daily life in Esperanza Nueva, a town square with a church, streets lined with houses, children playing in a schoolyard. The level of detail suggested these weren't imaginary drawings but memories of a real place. Can you tell me about your school in Esperanza Nueva? I asked Maria, who seemed more comfortable talking than her younger brother. Escuela Primaria Benito Juarez, she replied immediately. Senora Martinez is my teacher. We have 23 students in my class, and the school has 6 classrooms. The playground has swings and a soccer field, but the grass is brown because we don't have enough water. Her description was specific and detailed, including the names of classmates, teachers, and local businesses in Esperanza Nueva. But when Border Patrol contacted Mexican authorities to verify the existence of the school or the city, they found no records of either. Sheriff Rodriguez, Carlos said privately, I've contacted every municipal authority in Sonora, and no one has ever heard of a place called Esperanza Nueva. But this family has identity documents, school records, even medical records that all reference this city that doesn't exist. The documents Miguel carried were authentic Mexican identification papers, issued by what appeared to be legitimate government offices in Esperanza Nueva. Birth certificates, marriage license, even vaccination records for the children. All of them bore official seals and signatures from municipal authorities in a city that had no record of existing. I decided to investigate the area where Miguel claimed their city was located. With Carlos as backup, I drove south toward the border, following GPS coordinates that should have led us to the outskirts of Esperanza Nueva. What we found was exactly what the satellite images had shown. Empty desert stretching to the horizon, broken only by scattered creosote bushes and the occasional barrel cactus. No roads, no structures, no signs that humans had ever established a permanent presence in this location. But as we stood in the place where Miguel insisted his city should be, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were tire tracks in the sand, fresh ones, leading from our current position toward the north. The tracks suggested that vehicles had recently traveled from this location toward the border, despite the fact that there was no visible destination for those vehicles to have come from. Carlos, look at these tracks, Multiple vehicles, different sizes, all heading north from this empty spot. Carlos knelt to examine the tire impressions more closely. These are fresh, probably made within the last 48 hours. But there's no road here, no reason for anyone to be driving through this area. We followed the tire tracks for about 2 miles before they intersected with a legitimate smuggling route that Border Patrol agents monitored regularly. The tracks suggested that a convoy of vehicles had somehow materialized in the empty desert and driven north toward known crossing points. That night, I received a call from the Border Patrol Communications Center reporting something that transformed this case from mysterious to terrifying. Sheriff Rodriguez, we're picking up radio transmissions that appear to be coming from somewhere south of the border, but the content doesn't match anything our intelligence sources are familiar with. The radio traffic was in Spanish, consisting of what sounded like municipal emergency services, police, fire, medical calls, all referencing locations and street addresses in Esperanza Nueva. The transmissions were professional, routine, exactly what you'd expect from a functioning city's emergency services. Unidad 23 a despacho. Tenemos una emergencia médica en calle Revolución 847. Solicitamos ambulancia inmediata. Bomberos a Unidad 12, respondiendo a incendio en el sector industrial, Avenida Juárez y Morelos. Policía Municipal, Código 2 en la Plaza Central. Disturbio menor, 2 unidades en camino. The radio communications continued throughout the night, painting a picture of a busy city dealing with the normal range of urban emergencies. But when Border Patrol attempted to triangulate the source of the transmissions, they found that the signals were coming from the same empty desert area where Miguel claimed Esperanza Nueva was located. I drove back to the processing station to interview the Santos family again, this time with a linguist from the University of Arizona who specialized in regional dialects and could help me understand cultural details that might explain their situation. Dr. Patricia Morales listened to the family's story and examined their documents with growing fascination. Sheriff, the Spanish dialect these people speak is consistent with the Sonoran region, but there are linguistic elements I've never encountered before. Certain vocabulary choices, pronunciation patterns, even the way they structure sentences suggests they're from an isolated community that's been developing language independently for several decades. What does that mean? It means that if they're from a real place, it's a place that's been cut off from mainstream Mexican culture for a long time. The language evolution suggests geographic and social isolation on a scale that would be impossible in the modern world. Dr. Morales interviewed the children extensively, asking them to describe details of their daily life in Esperanza Nueva. Their answers were consistent, detailed, and revealed cultural practices that seemed like a mixture of traditional Mexican customs and innovations that shouldn't have existed. Maria, can you tell me about the festivals in your city? We celebrate Dia de la Esperanza every October, Maria replied. The whole city comes to the plaza for music and dancing. The mayor gives a speech about how our city will someday be recognized by the outside world. Papa says it's been celebrated for 50 years since the city was founded. Who founded the city? The families who came here during the time of troubles. Mama says there were problems in Mexico a long time ago, and some people came to this valley to start a new life. They built Esperanza Nueva to be a perfect city where everyone would be safe and happy. The time of troubles Miguel and Carmen referenced appeared to be their community's term for some kind of crisis that had driven the original settlers to establish their city in the 1970s. But Mexican historical records showed no evidence of large-scale population movements or refugee settlements during that period. Over the next 3 days, I coordinated with Mexican authorities to investigate the area more thoroughly. A joint Border Patrol and Policia Federal operation used helicopters, ground-penetrating radar, and satellite imagery to scan every square mile within a 50-mile radius of the coordinates Miguel had provided. They found no trace of any settlement, current or historical. No foundations, no debris, no evidence that humans had ever established a permanent presence in that region of the Sonoran Desert. But on the third day of the search, Mexican authorities made a discovery that challenged everything we thought we knew about the case. A Policia Federal helicopter flying search patterns south of the border reported visual contact with what appeared to be a small city in the exact location Miguel had described. Sheriff Rodriguez, this is Captain Hernandez with the Mexican Federal Police. We have visual confirmation of a settlement at coordinates 31.2456, negative 112.7832. Population appears to be approximately 3,000 to 5,000 people. Modern infrastructure, paved roads, commercial and residential districts. I immediately contacted the Border Patrol Aviation Unit and requested that they verify the Mexican report. Within 2 hours, a U.S. Customs helicopter was airborne and heading toward the coordinates Captain Hernandez had provided. But when the American aircraft reached the location, they found only empty desert. No city, no structures, no signs of human habitation. Radio contact with the Mexican helicopter confirmed that they were looking at the same coordinates, but seeing completely different terrain. "This is Border Patrol Air Unit 7, the pilot reported. "We are at the coordinates provided by Mexican authorities. Negative on any structures or settlements. Terrain shows typical Sonoran Desert. No signs of development or habitation. Captain Hernandez, can you confirm your current location?" "Affirmative. We are at coordinates 31.2456, negative 112.7832. We have clear visual on a small city with modern infrastructure. Population visible in streets and public areas. This is definitely a functioning municipal center." Both aircraft were at the same location, confirmed by GPS and radar tracking from both sides of the border. But they were seeing completely different landscapes, as if they were looking at alternate versions of reality occupying the same physical space. The Mexican helicopter was able to land in what their crew described as a soccer field on the outskirts of Esperanza Nueva. They spoke with local residents who confirmed the city's history and explained that border crossers occasionally left the community to seek opportunities in the United States. But when Border Patrol attempted to land at the same coordinates, their aircraft nearly crashed into a rock formation that the Mexican crew insisted wasn't there. Dr. Morales suggested a theory that sounded like science fiction, but was the only explanation that fit the evidence. "Sheriff, it's possible that Esperanza Nueva exists in what quantum physicists call a parallel dimension, a reality that occupies the same physical space as our world, but is normally invisible to us. How is that possible? There are theoretical models suggesting that under certain conditions, particularly in areas of geological instability or electromagnetic anomalies, barriers between parallel realities can become permeable. People and objects can cross between dimensions, usually without realizing they've moved from one reality to another. The Sonoran Desert region, where Esperanza Nueva was allegedly located, sits on a complex network of geological fault lines and has been the site of unusual electromagnetic activity for decades. Military installations in the area had reported equipment malfunctions and communication anomalies that defied technical explanation. "If Dr. Morales is right," I said to Carlos, "then Miguel's family accidentally crossed from their dimension into ours when they were trying to reach the United States." "Which means they can't go back," Carlos replied. "Even if we could find the crossing point, there's no guarantee it would still be open or that they'd end up in their own reality. The Santos family was eventually granted asylum in the United States based on the impossibility of returning them to their country of origin. Miguel found work as a translator for immigration services, where his knowledge of isolated community dialects proved valuable. Carmen became a teacher's aide at a local elementary school, and the children adapted to American schools remarkably quickly. But 6 months after their arrival, I received a report that reminded me this case was far from over. Border Patrol agents apprehended another family claiming to be from Esperanza Nueva, carrying similar documents and telling similar stories about their journey from a city that doesn't exist. This family provided additional details about their community: a municipal airport that served small aircraft, a radio station that broadcast local news and music, even a small hospital with modern medical equipment. All of it located in a reality that paralleled our own, but remained invisible to most observation methods. Over the past year, 17 more families have crossed the border from Esperanza Nueva, all of them carrying documentation from a city that exists only in satellite photographs taken by Mexican authorities who happen to be looking at the right coordinates when atmospheric conditions allow visibility between dimensions. I've established a protocol for handling these cases, working with immigration services to process people who are technically asylum seekers from a parallel reality. It's not a situation covered by any existing legal framework, but it's becoming frequent enough that we need standardized procedures. The families who've crossed over maintain contact with each other, forming a small community of interdimensional refugees living in Arizona and New Mexico. They've provided detailed maps and descriptions of Esperanza Nueva, creating a complete picture of a city that was founded in the 1970s by Mexican families seeking to escape some kind of crisis that may have only occurred in their reality. Some of the refugees speak of wanting to return to Esperanza Nueva someday, to reunite with family members who remained behind. But the crossing points between dimensions appear to be random and temporary, opening and closing according to patterns that no one understands. Dr. Morales continues to study the linguistic and cultural evolution of the Esperanza Nueva community, documenting how their society developed in isolation from mainstream Mexican culture. Their stories provide insight into how human communities adapt when they're cut off from the outside world, even when that isolation is the result of existing in a parallel dimension. I patrol the border region regularly, watching for signs that new crossing points might be opening. Sometimes, late at night when atmospheric conditions are right, I can pick up radio transmissions from Esperanza Nueva on certain frequencies. Music, news broadcasts, emergency services, calls from a city that exists just beyond the edge of our reality. The border between the United States and Mexico isn't just a line on a map separating two countries. In some places, it's a boundary between different versions of reality, where people can cross from one dimension to another without realizing they've left their original world behind. Esperanza Nueva remains a functioning city in a parallel version of our reality, continuing to send refugees across dimensional boundaries when conditions allow passage between worlds. They arrive carrying documentation from a government that doesn't exist in our reality, speaking dialects that evolved in isolation, and bringing stories of a community that has thrived in the spaces between what we consider possible and impossible. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes those secrets include entire cities that exist in the shadows of our reality, visible only to those who happen to be looking from the right angle when the barriers between worlds become thin enough to allow passage. Border security involves more than just monitoring for illegal crossings. Sometimes it means helping people who've accidentally crossed between dimensions find their place in a reality that wasn't the one they intended to reach. The Santos family and the other refugees from Esperanza Nueva remind us that home isn't just a place on a map. Sometimes it's a state of being that exists in the spaces between realities, where human communities can flourish even when they're invisible to the rest of the world. And sometimes, when the conditions are right and the barriers between dimensions become permeable, those communities send their children across the boundary into our reality, carrying with them proof that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than we ever imagined possible. Clearwater County sits in the rain shadow of the Cascade Mountains, covering 2,100 square miles of dense forest, pristine lakes, and mountain peaks that stay snow-capped most of the year. Highway 9 cuts through the heart of our territory, 47 miles of two-lane blacktop that connects our county seat to the interstate, winding through some of the most beautiful and isolated wilderness in the Pacific Northwest. I've been sheriff here for 12 years, and most of my calls involve hikers who've gotten lost in the national forest, accidents on the logging roads, and the occasional domestic dispute in one of our 5 small communities. It's the kind of place where people move to escape the complications of modern life, where neighbors still help neighbors, and the biggest crime wave might involve 3 break-ins during a particularly hard winter. That all changed on October 15th, when Highway 9 developed a passenger who's been riding with drivers for over 3 months now, and everyone who's given her a ride has disappeared within 48 hours. The first report came from Tom Bradley, who owns Bradley's service station at mile marker 23. Tom had been running that gas station for 18 years and knew every regular customer who traveled Highway 9. He called my office at 6:45 a.m. in a state of considerable agitation. "Sheriff Walsh, I need to report something strange that happened last night. Around 11 p.m., Jake Morrison stopped for gas, and he had a passenger with him I'd never seen before. Young woman, maybe early 20s, sitting in the front seat. But when Jake went inside to pay, I looked back at his truck and the woman was gone. Just vanished. I knew Jake Morrison. He lived alone on a cabin property about 15 miles north of the county seat, worked as a freelance carpenter, and was known throughout the county as a reliable, steady guy who didn't drink, didn't use drugs, and didn't associate with anyone who might cause trouble." "Did you ask Jake about the passenger?" "That's the strange part, Sheriff. When Jake came back out to his truck, I asked him where his passenger went. He looked at me like I was crazy, said he'd been driving alone all evening. But I swear I saw a woman in that truck when he pulled up to the pumps. I drove out to Jake's cabin that afternoon to check on him and ask about the previous night's trip. What I found was Jake's pickup truck parked in his driveway, keys still in the ignition, but no sign of Jake himself. The cabin was unlocked, and everything inside appeared normal. Coffee cup on the kitchen table with coffee still warm. Television on in the living room. Jake's work clothes laid out for the next day. But Jake Morrison was nowhere to be found. I organized a search of the surrounding forest, thinking Jake might have gone for a walk and suffered a medical emergency or accident. We covered a 5-mile radius around his property with volunteer searchers and search dogs, but found no trace of him. Jake's truck showed no signs of struggle or foul play, but when I examined it more closely, I found something that made my skin crawl. There were 2 sets of fingerprints on the passenger side door handle. Jake's prints, which made sense since it was his vehicle, and another set that belonged to someone who wasn't in any law enforcement database. The unknown prints were small, consistent with a young woman's hands, and they were fresh enough to have been made within the past 24 hours. 3 days later, I received a similar call from Maria Santos, who worked the evening shift at the Clearwater Diner at mile marker 31. She reported seeing the same mysterious passenger with another local resident. Sheriff David Chen stopped for dinner around 8 p.m. yesterday. He was alone when he came inside, but when I looked out the window at his car, there was a young woman sitting in the passenger seat. Dark hair, pale skin, wearing what looked like a white dress. Did you mention it to David? I asked him if his passenger wanted to come inside, and he looked at me real strange. Said he was alone, didn't know what I was talking about. But Sheriff, I saw her clear as day. She was looking right at me through the car window. I drove to David Chen's house that evening and found the same scenario that had played out at Jake's cabin. David's car was in the driveway, engine still warm, keys in the ignition. But David was gone, vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. The pattern repeated itself 5 more times over the next month. Local residents, always men traveling alone on Highway 9, would stop at gas stations or diners with a mysterious female passenger that only witnesses could see. The drivers themselves showed no awareness that anyone was in their vehicles. Within 48 hours, the drivers would disappear, leaving behind their cars and all their personal belongings, but no trace of where they'd gone. After the 7th disappearance, I requested assistance from the State Police Missing Persons Unit. Detective Frank Morrison arrived with a team of investigators who brought resources I couldn't access at the county level. Sheriff Walsh, we've seen similar patterns in 3 other rural counties over the past 5 years, Detective Morrison told me as we reviewed the case files. Always the same basic scenario. Men traveling alone pick up a female hitchhiker that only witnesses can see, then vanish within 2 days. Moonrise County is what you might call the middle of nowhere. If nowhere had 1,400 square miles of rolling prairie, isolated ranch properties, and exactly 1 town with a population that hovers around 280 people, depending on whether the Johnson kids are home from college. Highway 87 cuts through our territory like a scar across the landscape, connecting our county seat to the outside world via 120 miles of 2-lane road that sees maybe a dozen vehicles on a busy day. I've been sheriff here for 8 years, taking over from my predecessor who retired after 30 years of what he described as the quietest job in law enforcement. Most of my work involves checking on elderly residents during winter storms, mediating disputes between ranchers over water rights, and the occasional DUI when someone decides to drive home from the county's only bar after having a few too many. That all changed on August 14th, when the children of Moonrise County started disappearing during the full moon, and the only witnesses to their abductions were their own parents, who insist they willingly walked away with someone they loved and trusted. The first incident involved the Hartley family, who owned a sheep ranch about 20 miles northwest of town. Tom and Sarah Hartley called my office at 6:23 a.m., reporting that their 8-year-old daughter, Emma, had vanished sometime during the night. "Sheriff Creek, we need you out here right away." Tom's voice was shaking when I took the call. "Emma's gone. She's not in her room, not anywhere on the property, and her bedroom window is wide open." I drove out to the Hartley Ranch expecting to find evidence of a break-in or abduction, but what I discovered challenged every assumption I had about how children go missing in rural areas. Emma's bedroom showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. The window was indeed open, but it was opened from the inside, and there were no footprints or disturbances in the soft earth beneath it that would suggest someone had climbed in or out. More puzzling was what Tom and Sarah told me when I interviewed them about the previous evening. "Emma was excited about something yesterday," Sarah explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "She kept talking about her special friend who was coming to visit her. Said she'd been having dreams about this friend for weeks." "Did she describe this friend?" "A woman with long silver hair who wore a white dress," Tom replied. "Emma said the woman had been calling to her in her dreams, promising to show her wonderful things. We thought it was just typical kid imagination, maybe influenced by some movie she'd seen. But around midnight, we heard Emma talking to someone in her room. Sarah continued. Soft conversation, like she was happy to see whoever it was. We didn't check on her because she sounded content, not scared. When did you realize she was missing? This morning, when she didn't come down for breakfast, her room was empty, window open, and there was this strange smell in the air, like flowers, but flowers that only bloom at night. I examined Emma's room carefully, looking for any evidence of who she might have been talking to the night before. What I found were small bare footprints on the hardwood floor. Adult-sized, definitely made by a woman, but with unusual characteristics that made my skin crawl. The footprints showed no heel impact, as if the person who made them had been walking on the tips of their toes. More disturbing, the prints glowed faintly under ultraviolet light, suggesting some kind of phosphorescent material had been transferred from the visitor's feet to the floor. I organized a search of the surrounding ranch property, bringing in volunteers from town and borrowing search dogs from the state police. We covered a 10-mile radius around the Hartley property, checking every building, gully, and hiding place where a child might be concealed. But we found no trace of Emma Hartley, and the search dogs couldn't pick up her scent beyond the area immediately around her bedroom window. 3 weeks later, I received a similar call from the Morrison family, who lived on a cattle ranch about 15 miles south of the Hartley property. Their 10-year-old son Jake had disappeared during the night in circumstances that were nearly identical to Emma's vanishing. Same pattern, Sheriff, Deputy Lisa Santos reported after investigating the Morrison ranch. Boy was talking to someone in his room around midnight. Parents heard happy conversation. Child missing in the morning with bedroom window open from the inside. Any evidence of the visitor? Same phosphorescent footprints, same floral scent in the air. And Sheriff, there's something else. The boy's mother said Jake had been having dreams about a moon lady who promised to take him on adventures under the starlight. I compared the Morrison case to the Hartley investigation and found troubling similarities that suggested we were dealing with someone who was systematically targeting children in isolated ranch properties throughout Moonrise County. Both children had been having dreams about their abductor for weeks before they disappeared. Both had shown excitement rather than fear about their visitor. Both had apparently gone willingly, with no signs of force or coercion, and both disappearances had occurred during the full moon. I consulted with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, providing them with details of both cases and requesting a profile of the type of person who might be responsible for these abductions. Agent Patricia Coleman reviewed the case files and called me back with an assessment that was both helpful and disturbing. Sheriff Creek, the pattern suggests someone with extensive knowledge of child psychology and significant skill at building trust with potential victims. The dream contact indicates long-term grooming, possibly weeks or months of psychological preparation before physical contact. What about the phosphorescent footprints and the floral scent? Those elements suggest someone who's deliberately trying to create a supernatural or otherworldly persona, possibly using chemical agents to enhance the mysterious atmosphere of the encounters. Are we dealing with a cult or occult organization? It's possible, but more likely a single individual with specific psychological compulsions related to children and lunar cycles. The full moon timing suggests either religious delusions or a calculated attempt to leverage existing folklore about supernatural abductions. Agent Coleman recommended increased patrols during full moon periods and suggested that I warn parents throughout the county to be especially vigilant during those nights. But before I could implement her recommendations, we had a third disappearance that transformed this case from criminal to completely inexplicable. On September 12th, the night of the next full moon, 6-year-old Maria Santos vanished from her bedroom at her grandparents' ranch. Maria was Deputy Santos's niece, visiting for the weekend while her parents were out of town. What made this case different was that Deputy Santos had been specifically watching for signs of the mysterious visitor, and she witnessed Maria's abduction from start to finish. "Sheriff, I saw her," Deputy Santos reported when she called my office at 1:15 a.m. "The woman who's been taking our children. I watched her take Maria, and I still can't believe what I saw." I drove to the Santos ranch immediately, finding Deputy Santos in a state of shock that was completely out of character for one of the most level-headed officers I'd ever worked with. "Tell me exactly what you saw, Lisa." I was doing perimeter checks around the house, paying special attention to Maria's bedroom window. Around midnight, I saw movement in her room, so I positioned myself where I could observe without being detected. "What did you see?" "A woman, just like the children described. Long silver hair, white dress, but Sheriff, she wasn't walking. She was floating about 3 feet off the ground, moving through Maria's room like gravity didn't apply to her. Could you see her face? Beautiful, but not human. Her features were too perfect, too symmetrical, like someone had designed the ideal face and then given it an ethereal quality that made it almost painful to look at." "What happened to Maria?" "The woman approached Maria's bed and began speaking to her in a language I didn't recognize. Not Spanish, not any Native American dialect I'm familiar with. Something older, more musical. Maria woke up and immediately went to the woman like she'd been expecting her. Did Maria seem frightened? No, that's what was so disturbing. Maria was delighted to see her, like a child greeting a beloved aunt. She got out of bed, took the woman's hand, and walked to the window with her. Then what happened? They floated out the window together. Not jumping, not climbing, but floating like they were underwater. I ran outside to follow them, but by the time I reached the yard, they were already 50 feet in the air, moving toward the north pasture. Did you pursue them? I tried, Sheriff, but they were moving faster than any human could travel on foot. And the strangest thing, there was music in the air, like someone was playing a flute or maybe wind chimes, but the melody was coming from the sky itself. Deputy Santos was one of the most reliable officers I'd ever worked with, not given to exaggeration or flights of imagination. But her account of Maria's abduction described something that violated every law of physics and challenged basic assumptions about what was possible in the real world. I organized the largest search operation in Moonrise County's history, bringing in resources from 3 neighboring counties and requesting assistance from the National Guard. We used helicopters, thermal imaging equipment, and ground teams to cover every square mile within a 50-mile radius of the Santos Ranch. But we found no trace of Maria Santos or any of the other missing children. The searches did reveal something unexpected, though. Hidden in a box canyon about 30 miles north of town, we discovered what appeared to be an abandoned settlement from the 1800s. Log cabins, a small church, even a cemetery with headstones dating back to the 1870s. But according to county historical records, there had never been any settlement in that location. "Sheriff," the county historian told me when I asked her about the site, "I've researched every community that ever existed in Moonrise County, and there's no record of any town or settlement in that canyon. The area was considered too remote and difficult to access for permanent habitation. Yet the settlement clearly existed, and carbon dating of wood samples confirmed that the structures had been built in the late 1800s. Someone had established a community in that isolated canyon and then abandoned it for reasons that weren't recorded in any official documents. In the cemetery, I found graves for 17 children. All of them died between 1871 and 1889. The headstones bore epitaphs that were disturbing in their similarity. Called to dance among the stars, chosen for the moonlight procession. taken to join the celestial children. Every child's death was recorded as occurring during a full moon, and every grave contained evidence that the burials had been conducted with unusual ceremony. Items placed with the bodies included silver jewelry, dried flowers that had been arranged in complex patterns, and small musical instruments that appeared to be handmade. I contacted anthropologists from the State University to investigate the settlement and help me understand what kind of community would have practiced such unusual burial customs. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who specialized in frontier religious communities, spent 2 weeks examining the site and analyzing artifacts we'd recovered from the buildings. Sheriff Creek. This settlement appears to have been established by a group that practiced some form of lunar worship, Dr. Rodriguez told me. The architecture, the burial customs, even the layout of the community are all oriented around astronomical alignments related to moon phases. What happened to the people who lived there? Based on the artifacts and the condition of the buildings, it appears they abandoned the settlement suddenly sometime in the late 1880s. No signs of violence or natural disaster, but clear evidence that they left in a hurry. Could this be connected to the current disappearances? It's possible. Lunar worship cults often believe that children are particularly receptive to celestial influences during full moons. If the original community was involved in child abduction, they might have established patterns of behavior that persisted even after the settlement was abandoned. Dr. Rodriguez found something else in the settlement that made my blood run cold. Hidden beneath the floorboards of what had been the community's church, we discovered a journal written by someone who identified himself as Brother Samuel, keeper of the Children's Gate. The journal documented the community's beliefs and practices, including their conviction that children who were called by the Moon Mother during full moons were destined to join a celestial family that existed in the space between earth and sky. The children who are chosen show signs of the calling weeks before their time comes, Brother Samuel had written. They dream of the Moon Mother, speak of her beauty and kindness, and prepare themselves joyfully for the journey to the starlight realm. We do not take the children by force. The Moon Mother visits them in their dreams, prepares their hearts for departure, and when the time is right, they come willingly to join the procession of celestial youth who dance forever in the light of the eternal moon. The families grieve, but they do not understand that their children have been granted the greatest gift, eternal youth and joy in the Moon Mother's embrace, free from the sorrows and struggles of earthly existence. The journal contained detailed records of 43 children who had been called by the Moon Mother between 1871 and 1889. All of them had disappeared during full moons. All of them had been reported as going willingly with a beautiful woman who visited them in their dreams. And according to Brother Samuel's final entries, the Moon Mother's calling wasn't limited to the 19th century. She was an eternal being who would continue to gather children across the generations, returning to areas where she had previously been welcomed to claim new young souls for her celestial family. The settlement may be abandoned, but the Moon Mother's work continues. The journal's final entry read, "Sheriff Creek, this is going to sound crazy, but I saw what looked like children dancing in that old ghost town. Dozens of them moving in circles around some kind of bonfire. And there was a woman with long silver hair directing the whole thing. I assembled a response team and drove to the settlement site during the next full moon, hoping to finally confront whoever was responsible for the abductions. What we found there challenged every assumption I'd made about the nature of the case. The settlement was alive with activity. Buildings that had been empty ruins during daylight hours were now illuminated and apparently inhabited. Children were indeed dancing in the central area, but they weren't the missing children from our county. These were dozens of children from different time periods, wearing clothing that spanned from the 1800s to the present day. and they were translucent, like images projected onto mist, moving through their dance with joy that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. At the center of the procession was the Moon Mother herself, exactly as Deputy Santos had described her. Beautiful beyond human standards, ethereal, conducting the children's dance with gestures that seemed to direct moonlight itself. When she noticed our presence, she approached with no sign of fear or concern about law enforcement. "Sheriff Creek," she said in a voice that sounded like wind through silver chimes, "you've come to see the children who have been blessed with eternal joy. I've come to arrest you for kidnapping and to recover the children you've taken." The children came willingly, as children always do when they understand the choice being offered. A lifetime of earthly struggle and eventual death, or eternal youth dancing in starlight with friends who will never leave them. They're just children. They can't make that kind of decision. Children understand joy better than adults understand sorrow. They see the beauty in what I offer without the complications that make adults cling to a world that will only disappoint them. She gestured toward the dancing children, and I could see Emma Hartley, Jake Morrison, and Maria Santos among them. They looked exactly as they had when they disappeared, unchanged by the months that had passed, moving through the dance with expressions of pure happiness. They're safe, Sheriff. Safer than they would ever be in a world where children suffer and families break apart, and dreams are slowly crushed by the weight of reality. Their families want them back. Their families love the children they remember, but these children have grown beyond the limitations of mortal existence. They cannot return to a smaller life after experiencing infinite possibility. I tried to approach the dancing children, but found that I couldn't enter the circle they were moving within. Some kind of barrier prevented physical contact, as if they existed in a space that paralleled our world, but remained separate from it. "The settlement is where two worlds touch," the Moon Mother explained. "During full moons, when the barrier between realities is thinnest, the children can choose which world they want to inhabit. All of them have chosen the realm of eternal moonlight." The Moon Mother and her procession of children faded with the dawn, leaving behind an empty settlement that showed no signs of recent activity. But I had seen enough to understand that we weren't dealing with a human kidnapper or a conventional crime. The children were safe, happier than they'd ever been in their earthly lives, but they were lost to families who couldn't understand the choice their children had made. I continued to monitor the settlement site during full moons, watching for signs that the Moon Mother has returned. The disappearances have stopped since I implemented the protective protocols, but I know she's still out there, waiting for opportunities to offer her gift to children who might be receptive to promises of eternal joy. Moonrise County's children are protected now, but the settlement serves as a reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers come disguised as the most beautiful offers. The Moon Mother provides exactly what she promises: eternal youth, eternal happiness, eternal freedom from the struggles of mortal existence. But the price of that gift is leaving behind everyone and everything that makes life meaningful in the human world. It's a choice that children, in their innocence and trust, are all too willing to make when it's offered by someone who understands their capacity for wonder and joy. The full moon still rises over Moonrise County every month, illuminating the empty settlement where children dance in starlight with friends they'll never outgrow. They're safe, they're happy, and they're forever beyond the reach of families who love them enough to want them back. The moon. Mother's gift is real, but like all gifts that seem too good to be true, it comes with a cost that only becomes clear after it's your mind. 23 years I've been sheriff of this county, and I've seen plenty of things that don't make it into the official reports. Farmers who find their cattle arranged in perfect circles overnight. lights in the sky that moved too fast and turned too sharp to be airplanes, phone calls from numbers that were disconnected decades ago, but nothing prepared me for what we found at the Lockwood farm on March 15th, when an entire family vanished and left behind evidence that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality. The Lockwoods had been farming the same 640 acres for 4 generations. Robert Lockwood, his wife Sarah, and their 2 teenage children lived in the original farmhouse built by Robert's great-grandfather in 1892. They were good people, active in the community, the kind of family that represented everything positive about rural Nebraska. The call came in at 7:45 a.m. from Marie Patterson, the mail carrier who'd been delivering to rural Route 4 for 15 years. Marie knew every family on her route, their schedules, their habits, even their dogs' names. Sheriff Mills, something's wrong at the Lockwood place. The house is dark, no one answered when I knocked, and there's milk bottles from 3 days ago still sitting on the porch. That family's never missed collecting their milk. Not once in all the years I've been delivering out here. I drove out to the Lockwood farm expecting to find a medical emergency, or maybe a family that had left town unexpectedly for a funeral or crisis. The farm was located 8 miles east of Crawford, on a section of land that had been continuously cultivated since the 1890s. Good soil, reliable water, the kind of property that farming families pass down through generations. But when I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed things that set off my cop instincts. The front porch light was still on despite it being full daylight. The newspaper from 3 days ago was lying where it had been thrown, now yellowed and curled from exposure to weather. And most unsettling of all, the family's 2 border collies were nowhere to be seen. Those dogs never left the property. They were working animals, trained to help with the cattle and sheep, and they were protective of their territory. The fact that they weren't barking at my approach or running to investigate my patrol car was the first sign that something was seriously wrong. I knocked on the front door and identified myself as sheriff. No response from inside the house. I walked around the perimeter, checking windows and looking for signs of forced entry or struggle. Everything appeared secure and undisturbed. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual for rural properties. But when I entered the house, I found a scene that made my skin crawl. The Lockwood family had been in the middle of dinner when something happened. 4 place settings at the kitchen table, food still on the plates, coffee still in the cups. But the food had been sitting there long enough to spoil, and flies were beginning to gather. "Hello? Sheriff's Department?" I called out as I moved through the house. My voice echoed in rooms that felt empty in a way that went beyond simple absence. This wasn't a house where people had left for a few hours. This was a house where people had vanished. I found no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, no indication that the family had packed for a trip. Their clothes were still in closets, toiletries were still in the bathroom, and Robert's wallet was sitting on his dresser with over $200 in cash inside. But it was what I found in the children's rooms that really disturbed me. Both teenagers had homework spread across their desks, assignments that were half completed and dated for the day they disappeared. Pencils were lying where they'd been dropped mid-sentence, as if the kids had simply stopped writing and walked away. I radioed for backup and requested that Deputy Clark bring the crime scene camera. While I waited for him to arrive, I searched the outbuildings and checked on the livestock. The animals were fine, but they were clearly stressed. The cattle were bunched together in the far corner of their pasture, and the chickens were huddled in their coop despite it being the middle of the day. Most disturbing of all, I found the 2 border collies in the barn. They were alive but cowering in the corner, whimpering and refusing to come when I called. These were confident, well-trained animals, but they were acting like they'd been traumatized by something that had terrified them beyond their ability to cope. Deputy Clark arrived with the camera equipment, and we began documenting the scene. That's when we made the discovery that transformed this from a missing persons case into something that defied rational explanation. In the dirt floor of the barn, we found footprints. Dozens of them, all made by the same 4 people. 2 adults and 2 teenagers whose shoe sizes matched the missing family members. But the footprints didn't lead anywhere logical. They started at the barn entrance and moved in a complex pattern across the floor, sometimes overlapping, and sometimes forming geometric shapes that looked almost ritualistic. But strangest of all, they ended in the center of the barn floor, in a perfect circle about 6 feet in diameter, with no tracks leading away from that spot. "Sheriff," Deputy Clark said, photographing the prints, "it looks like they all walked to the center of the barn and then just disappeared." I knelt down to examine the circle where the footprints ended. The dirt was packed down hard, as if something heavy had been pressing on it, but there were no other marks or disturbances that might explain what had happened to the family. That's when I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. In the exact center of the circle there was a small hole in the ground. Not big enough for a person to fall through, maybe 3 inches in diameter, but it was perfectly round and appeared to go straight down into the earth. I got a flashlight from my patrol car and shined it down the hole. The beam disappeared into darkness without revealing a bottom. I dropped a small stone into the opening and listened for it to hit the ground below. I never heard it land. "Clark, we need to call the state police and request their technical investigation unit, and get me a county surveyor out here. I want to know what's under this barn." While we waited for additional resources, I continued searching the property. That's when I found the journal. It was in Robert Lockwood's study, open to an entry dated 3 days earlier, the day the family had disappeared. The handwriting was Robert's, but the content was unlike anything I'd expected from a practical farmer. March 15th. The sounds from beneath the barn have been getting louder every night. Sarah thinks we should call someone, but who would believe us? The ground is shifting, and I can feel something moving down there, something big. The animals know. They've been acting strange for weeks. Found another hole this morning, bigger than the others. This one is different. When I put my ear to it, I can hear voices, singing. It's not in any language I recognize, but it sounds like it's coming from very far away. The children are scared. They say they can hear it in their bedrooms at night, especially when the wind is blowing from the north. Jenny won't sleep in her room anymore. She's been sleeping on the couch in the living room. I think something is trying to communicate with us. The patterns in the dirt, the way the holes appear in specific locations, it's too organized to be random. Whatever's down there, it's intelligent, and it's been waiting for something. If something happens to us, if we disappear like the Henderson family did back in 1987, I want people to know that we didn't just walk away from our lives. We were called. Something under our land has been calling us for weeks, and tonight I think we're going to answer. I read that entry 3 times, trying to make sense of what Robert had written. The Henderson family? I'd never heard of any disappearance in 1987, but I'd only been sheriff for 2 years at that point. I called the county clerk's office and asked them to pull any missing person reports from 1987. What they found confirmed my worst fears. The Henderson family, 2 adults and 3 children, had indeed disappeared from their farm about 12 miles south of the Lockwood property. They'd vanished without a trace, and the case had never been solved. The State Police Technical Unit arrived that afternoon with ground-penetrating radar and drilling equipment. What they found beneath the Lockwood barn defied every geological survey that had ever been conducted in Crawford County. "Sheriff," the lead technician said, showing me the radar images, "according to our equipment, there's a massive cavern system under this property. We're talking about chambers that extend down at least 200 feet, possibly more. But according to the geological surveys, this area is solid bedrock. There shouldn't be any caves here. What about that hole in the barn floor?" "That's the strangest part. Our equipment shows that the hole connects to the cavern system, but the acoustic measurement suggests that the chambers extend much deeper than our equipment can detect. When we lowered a camera into the opening, the cable ran out at 500 feet without reaching the bottom." The video footage from the camera showed smooth, carved walls that looked more like they'd been constructed than naturally formed. And at the limits of the camera's range, just before the feed cut out, there were structures that looked artificial. Geometric shapes, possibly buildings, arranged in patterns that suggested intelligent design. "There's something else, Sheriff," the technician continued. "We're picking up electromagnetic anomalies throughout the cavern system. Radio waves, but not random static. They're structured, patterned, like some kind of communication signal." I requested that the FBI's Missing Persons Unit be brought in to assist with the investigation, but before they could arrive, we had another development that changed everything. At 3:17 a.m. on March 18th, 3 days after the family had disappeared, every phone in Crawford County received the same call. Not just landlines, but cell phones, emergency services, even the radio equipment in police and fire vehicles. All of them carried the same message, delivered in voices that sounded like the missing Lockwood family. I was at home when my phone rang, and when I answered, I heard Sarah Lockwood's voice, clear as if she was calling from next door. "Sheriff Mills, we're safe. We're where we're supposed to be now. Don't look for us. Don't send anyone else down into the caves. Some places aren't meant for people from the surface world." "Sarah? Where are you? Are the children with you?" "We're all here, Sheriff, all of us. The Hendersons, the Morrison family from 1962, the others who were called before us. This is where we belong now. The earth called us home." The line went dead before I could ask any more questions. But when I called dispatch to report the contact, I learned that every officer in the county had received identical calls from different members of the Lockwood family, all delivering variations of the same message. The FBI investigation concluded after 2 weeks with no concrete findings. The cavern system was sealed with concrete, and the Lockwood property was purchased by the county for geological safety reasons. The official report classified the family's disappearance as unexplained, with no evidence of foul play. But I knew the truth. The Lockwood family hadn't been abducted or murdered. They'd been called by something that lived beneath our feet, something that had been collecting families for decades, possibly longer. I started researching historical records, looking for other families that had disappeared without explanation in Crawford County. What I found was a pattern going back to the 1800s. Every 15 to 20 years, a farming family would vanish from their property, always leaving behind signs of normal life interrupted mid-activity. The Jameson family in 1962, the O'Brien family in 1943, the Kowalski family in 1928. All of them had farmed in the same general area. All of them had disappeared without a trace, and all of them had been forgotten within a generation, as their properties were sold and their cases filed away as unsolved mysteries. But now I understood what had really happened to them. They'd been recruited by whatever civilization existed in the cavern system beneath Crawford County, called down into the earth to join a community that existed outside normal human society. 3 months after the Lockwood disappearance, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of the Lockwood family, standing in what appeared to be a vast underground chamber. They looked healthy, happy, unchanged by their time beneath the earth. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a message. The earth remembers all her children. When the time comes, Sheriff Mills, you'll hear the calling too. I've been hearing strange sounds at night for the past 2 months. Voices calling from beneath the ground. Songs in languages that don't exist on the surface world. And sometimes when I'm alone in my house late at night, I can hear Sarah Lockwood calling my name from somewhere very far below. The Lockwood farm has been empty for 6 months now, but the land isn't really vacant. It's waiting, listening, preparing to call another family home to the ancient civilization that lives beneath Crawford County. And someday, when my time as sheriff is done, I think I'll be ready to answer that call. To join the Lockwoods and all the other families who've been chosen to be part of something larger than surface life. The earth is patient. She can wait, but she never forgets her children.